What's up everyone, welcome back to Smith Does Games. And we're not actually talking about games today, we are talking about films. So I wanted to make a video with my impressions for Avengers Infinity War. I saw the film on Friday, and I wanted just to get my thoughts together and kind of give you a little review of the film. Just so I've got some video in the background of this, I'm just going to use some gameplay from the PUBG Miramar test server that was on over this weekend. I've got quite a lot of footage for that, and I'm going to be working on an impressions video which should be going up either later today or tomorrow, so watch out for that. But for now, the gameplay is not really that important. This is more about the review of the film. So first off, I think when talking about this film in particular, and I mean at this point I suppose kind of any MCU film, but I think with Infinity War this is the case more than with almost any of the other MCU films we've seen. And I think your experience with this film is going to be pretty heavily dependent on your kind of current attitude to the MCU. And so that's kind of what I'll say first. For my quick kind of takeaway, if you are really into the MCU and you love all the films that come out and you're right there with it, you're really excited for this film, I think you're probably going to love it. Now, from my personal point of view, that's not really where I am with the MCU. I'm pretty burnt out on all the Marvel films. I mean, this is Marvel film number 19, and Iron Man was the first one in 2008. That's nearly two films a year, every year. And this film is coming off of Black Panther coming out just a couple months ago, and then just a couple months before that, we had Thor Ragnarok. So they're coming so thick and fast, and I just cannot muster up the interest that perhaps I used to have. And so that's kind of where I am. And I think that did definitely inform my experience with this film. And I say I'm burned out. Black Panther was obviously the most recent film before this one, and that's probably my favourite MCU film. But a big part of why I liked that film so much was that I felt like it kind of breathed new life into the MCU. It felt different, they were doing different things. I liked that they gave Black Panther to more of a visionary director, Ryan Coogler, and he created a film that was definitely a lot more than the sum of its parts, and avoided a lot of the major issues that I have with films from the MCU. And unfortunately, Infinity War doesn't do that really at all. So I think a lot of the MCU films, to me, feel more like product than they do actual filmmaking. It kind of feels like each film is just laying the groundwork for the next film, and effectively the point of each movie that you go and see is just to try and get you to go back and watch the next one that comes out. And Infinity War does not escape this. And I think with this film it's almost more disappointing and more frustrating than it is with the others, because this is the big culmination, this is the big crossover. So if all the other films are laying the groundwork for something, it should be this. This should be the film in which we get it delivered on. We have watched all of these films up to now so that we could watch this one. And so for it to feel like Infinity War is basically just laying the groundwork for Infinity War Part 2, or whatever they're going to call Avengers 4, is really disappointing, and kind of it takes the soul away from it. This film to me didn't feel like it had much of a heart to it. And I think that's kind of the thing that just ran through the film for me, which just left me kind of unengaged. So, I mean, right off the bat, I think this film struggles with all of the characters that it's trying to juggle. It's trying to basically handle every Marvel hero, and it's trying to bring them all in, get them to meet, make it feel impactful. And I understand that they're doing that, but it really just was not coming together properly. And so, especially in the first sort of half of the film, it just felt like massive overload. It felt really like they bit off more than they could chew. And effectively what it ends up boiling down to is you kind of zip from scene to scene, each with different characters, and it really feels like such mechanical filmmaking more than it does artful or emotional filmmaking in any sense. It very much feels like, hey, okay, we go over here, we introduce this character, and then almost we're trying to get out of the scene as quickly as we've gone into it, because we've got all these other characters to try and fit in, and it constantly feels like the film's working against the clock. And so what it basically boils down to is each scene with each new character is just some clunky, kind of heavy-handed exposition, and then we just move on. And I think this would be probably more forgivable if the film came together better than it does, because yeah, okay, you know, you're zipping around, you're introducing all the characters, you're setting up the exposition. Sometimes that is kind of just what films have to do. You know, they've only got a limited runtime, and I get that. So sometimes you just need to get in, you know, it's not necessarily pleasant, you know, sometimes it's kind of quick and ugly, but you get the exposition out there, you make sure everyone's on the same page, and then you move on. But the issue is that we kind of race through all of this stuff, which in my opinion would be the more interesting stuff. You know, the characters meeting each other, interacting with each other. You get characters that have never met each other before, meeting each other for the first time. That is where the dynamic, I think, is the most interesting in the MCU. But we kind of race through all of that in order to get to what the second half of the film, which kind of felt to me just like a string of just CGI heavy action scenes, which feel almost completely weightless. And I mean that in the sense that they have very little tangible feel to them, as well as being emotionally weightless. It basically just feels like action for the sake of action. And I mean, like, action in MCU films, I think, has always been one of the weakest points of them. Like, they don't look particularly good. They're not particularly easy to track. They don't feel particularly good. They don't have much of a tangible feel. I mean, like, you look at something like Mad Max Fury Road, say, like, that's an action film which has like a real tangible feel to it. And so the action scenes, even if they're not driving the plot forward much, they're just incredible to watch, and it really it's a kind of a visceral experience. Like, the MCU just doesn't have that. It feels so glossy and weightless and fake. And I think there's a lot of, like, in Infinity War, that kind of describes everything, and that is the issue, I think, that kind of constantly brings down the Marvel films in terms of their action, certainly. And this film definitely doesn't escape that. And it's a shame, because I think the allure of these big kind of crossover films, these culmination kind of events, is supposed to be that you get all your favourite characters all together. And we spent a long time, you know, kind of growing with these characters, getting to know them, and then to see them all come together and interact with each other is supposed to be this incredible payoff. But actually, this film, I don't think, does justice to really any of the characters except for Thanos and Gamora, which I'll talk about a little bit in a bit. But it's just, actually, I think the character-driven stuff is much better done in your heroes in independent films, you know, in the films that make up the phase, rather than these big culmination events. And what ends up happening with these kind of big crossover films, and I thought the same thing happened in Age of Ultron, and to some extent I actually think the same thing about the first Avengers, because I'm not the biggest fan of the first Avengers either. And it's a lot of the more interesting stuff, a lot of the stuff that the MCU does best, you know, these character moments, the stories of these characters, is kind of forgotten, and then the emphasis is just put on the action, which is the thing that the MCU does the worst. But like I say, there are good elements in this film, and probably the main one in my mind is Thanos as a villain. Now, I don't think Thanos is quite as good a villain as Killmonger was in Black Panther, but he has that same allure to him, which is that the film does a very good job of actually humanizing him. And this is what I talk about when I say that the film, the only character that the film really do justice to is Thanos and Gamora. And obviously Gamora, if you've seen any of the other films, you'll probably know that Gamora is, you know, grew up as Thanos' daughter. And so there's a link there between them. And the film explores that and actually does it very well. Now, Thanos is obviously evil. He wants to basically get all the Infinity Stones and kind of wipe out half the universe. But they do a good job of humanizing him and giving him a chance to put forward why he thinks what he's doing is right. And there's kind of that thing, you know, there's kind of a saying in storytelling, which is, you know, the best villains are the heroes of their own story. And I think that kind of does apply to Thanos. I think in his mind, he is doing the right thing. And all of the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy and not everybody else are actually the villains, because they are trying to stop him from doing what he believes is the right thing to do. And because of that, his relentlessness feels, you can almost sympathize with it a bit more. They also make him scarier than any of the other villains because he just remains so calm throughout the film, which is just an excellent move on that part. And part of the credits obviously got to go to Josh Brolin here. I think he does a really good job of voicing Thanos, especially considering he's got no real physical performance to work with, because obviously he's just a big purple CGI blob. But he is so calm all the way throughout, and it just proves to be much more terrifying. He's like completely unflappable, which makes it feel like he is so certain that he's going to win, and that kind of sense of doom and like his assuredness of the success of his plan does kind of translate across to the way the heroes behave, which is they kind of also are pretty sure his plan's going to work. And so the dynamic of the film is interesting because this is the first time that the film doesn't necessarily feel like a foregone conclusion that the heroes are going to win necessarily, and that is an interesting dynamic for the MCU to have, which isn't always the case, I don't think. And I also really like where they end the film. Now, obviously, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I like where the film ends. But I mean, my reservation with that is that the fourth Avengers film, which is I think Infinity War Part 2, I don't know if it's been announced what the title is, but whatever they end up calling it, is coming out like next year. And that is a shame to me because the way this film ends would actually be a very interesting transition into another phase of Marvel films. I would like to see the fallout from the events of this film a little bit more. But with the kind of second part of this coming so soon, I am not convinced that they're not just going to find a very kind of convenient way to just undo a lot of those things. And so there are certainly moments in this film that will have a lasting effect, but there are things that it's suggested that they're going to almost completely reshape the MCU, and I have very little faith that they're not just going to find a convenient way just to kind of undo it all. And so those moments, those story beats just have very little resonance for me. I don't hate this film, but I didn't really like it much either. I think there's some decent funny moments in it, and as with all the MCU films, there's some nice little sort of character touches. A lot of the acting's pretty good, but I mean, the film's very long. The film's like 2.5 hours long, and it doesn't need to be that long. So much of it is just these kind of CGI heavy action scenes which hold like no weight whatsoever, and there's far too many of them, and most of them outstay their welcome. And to be honest, at times, particularly throughout a lot of the second half of the film, I felt so unengaged with it. It was more like just watching a cinematic trailer for some, new Marvel MMO than it did a culmination of 10 years of kind of layered storytelling. That's where I stand on the film. Let me know what you thought if you've seen it. Like I say, my suspicion is that a lot of your big MCU fans are going to be singing this film's praises. They're going to really, really love it. And I think that's great. Like, I do think it is successful for those people. It's a shame for me because I used to be so much more into the MCU than I am now, and I'd love to get that spark back. And I thought perhaps it was coming back because I loved Thor Ragnarok and I love Black Panther so much, but this is maybe just taking the edge off again for me. The film feels like a product, and it feels like it's soulless. So yeah, thanks for watching the video. Leave a like if you liked the video, dislike it if you didn't, and subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks very much. Bye.